Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, dear CIOs and IT community. I hope you enjoyed the round tables, of course, the thematic round tables, and that you took some energy for the next sessions of extraordinary keynote speakers and panel discussions. Because why? Well, nowadays, let's be honest, a lot of CIOs are really looking at creating ecosystem together with high potential scale-ups, startups even. Why? Well, first of all, to increase technology perspectives, opportunities, capabilities, but also to learn from each other, to share with each other, and to gain each other's technological expertise. But although working together with startups and scale-ups can be a very complex exercise, it's worth it, even if we need to take into account different factors behind the technological value. So I think for now, it's time to go deeper into co-creation. And luckily for us, we're having 4 extraordinary CEOs here in our panel. I would like to introduce them to you. First of all, welcome Jonathan Berthe, Chief Executive Officer RoboVision. Tine van den Brede, CEO Mobile Expense, Mark de Korte, CEO InnoWings, and Duco Singingen, CEO Fortino Capital. And why? Well, it's really important that we also have their point of view of co-creation and working together with startups and scale-ups. So welcome, dear panelists. Very nice to have you here in our CIO leadership panel and studio. So maybe let's kick off just with a very logic question. Why is it so important working together with startups and scale-ups? Is it access to technology, talent, speed of innovation? What do you think, dear Jonathan?
Well, I think it's the agility of smaller teams in comparison with big companies. And I think it's a healthy, how could I say, equilibrium between those two. Both need each other. Big corporates have much bigger opportunities, and smaller corporations have a lot more reactive power towards innovation trends and new technologies.
And if you really look at it from the point of view from the CIO from bigger companies?
Well, I think it's inspirational. I think it enlarges the radar of the bigger corporate. And it's also a nice addition for the own team, for the in-house team. So I strongly believe in both sides of this ecosystem.
For example, Duco, if we look at Fortino Capital, what's your point of view? Why working with startups and scale-ups? And I know that you are very eager in supporting them.
Well, you know, as an investor, we're not directly involved in the co-creation. Basically, our companies do that. We have, for example, a great example in Antwerp, SupplyStack. They worked with very large companies like Sony and some other major leaders on a transport management system. And you know, that is the difference between doing something completely customized as opposed to do something that will be valid for multiple companies. So you have, on one hand, the opportunity to work with a small company, new generation developers, agility, as Jonathan just mentioned. And I think for the company, it is good because they get the chance to work with multiple corporates and make sure that their product market fit is right there where it should be. So I think it's an enormous galvanizing process in many cases where both the corporate wins, they get ahead much faster, and the company wins because they're busy building their company.
Tine, is that also what you think, according to you? Maybe let's start with CIOs from bigger companies. Why, according to you, should they start working with startups?
Yeah, let me make it practical, maybe with an example. Recently, Mobile Expense as a scale-up engaged with SD Worx, a larger corporation, which is seen as a vessel that has set a course. And together with the CIO and the CEO of SD Worx, we found out that as they are on their track, they're this big vessel making not so many waves. They see us as the speedboat. Agility was mentioned, bringing innovation on a particular problem which we solve, on a particular answer, complementary to what they do. So I think that for CIOs of big companies, this speedboat, this agility which is brought, this innovation is very welcome as they steadily stay on their course, and speedboats help them to maneuver left and right.
And from the point of view from the startup itself, the biggest benefit?
imagine that as a small startup or scale-up, you can go through the waves with at your side this big vessel. It gives some certain security, it gives possibilities, it lets you stay on course as well.
Well, Tina, sometimes they say that startups, in your case scale-ups, sometimes are afraid of sharing expertise, for example, with large companies. Yeah, how is that feeling, and how do you ensure that the collaboration is really where we will have a win-win situation?
To me, the key word is trust. And when you are engaging in a partnership, it comes down to open communication upfront. Be predictable, both sides. Make clear agreements of where you're heading, who does what, how to monetize what you are co-creating. Having agreements upfront, open, transparent, makes that you build trust and makes that you can continue on a longer journey.
Well, thank you very much. Mark, same questions for you from the point of view of Innowings. Why should startups start working with larger companies? And the other question is, the opposite. What's the benefit for large companies when they work with scale-ups and startups?
Yeah, let's start maybe with my experience in a large corporation as a VP Digital. So I consider two big ways of looking at startups. Or you have done the business ecosystem, innovative ecosystem internally, and you look for building blocks in the market. And you look at startups who have pieces of technology that you can integrate as a large company in a bigger ensemble. That is one, that is more technology focused. The other one is business model focused. And when you see customers, businesses, ways of doing things changing, and as a big company, you don't want to engage directly fully in that, you can, of course, partner with startups who have already done a few miles more to test the model. And that's more and more important because future is less predictable. And so it's not only about testing technology, it's also about testing, will the model work? Will customer respond correctly?
So it's not only about the technology, but the whole model. And then the question is, of course, when there are so many startups and scale-ups, how, as a large company, can you make sure to pick up the right one? Are there any criteria for it?
So you're never sure you pick the right one, because it's a complete chaos and a big jungle out there, and it's impossible to follow them all. Now, there are a few tricks, of course. And I would say for a large company, look first into the geographies you are already present in, because it's not only important to find the startup, but then you have to work with it. And it's easier to work with it when you already have a physical presence. That is one. Secondly, for startup scale-ups, look into who already invested in there. If Fortino Capital, for example, already invested in there, that's probably a good sign. They've already done a due diligence on financial, on potential of the market, etc. And manage risks. Don't go with a startup as you would go with implementing an ERP for the full company. Stage gate the project so that you can manage risks at all time.
I think then that the same question goes for you, dear Duco, from the point of view of Fortino Capital. How would you select the startups and scale-ups to work with?
I think that the simplest rules are always the quality of the team. A good team can make of a poor opportunity something good, whereas the opposite is not true. So we look at people, and the leadership. Quality of developers, very important. And then, of course, we get a great view on what do they really want to achieve, which markets. Is the vertical market they want to address big enough to make it into a real product company? There are many large companies who ask for problems to be solved which may not represent ultimately a market. And that's where you have to be careful as a startup, that you don't walk away with just any corporate project. You have to say, can I extrapolate this into a company? And the corporate will love that because they want to be ensured that it's going to be a real company with a product and they're not going to end up as the only customer. That's probably their worst nightmare.
So from the beginning, you should set goals for the long term and not only the short term. From the point of view, also from the startup and scale up. So Tine and of course Jonathan, yeah, what would be the reason for you to engage with a larger company? What criteria are you using?
I think most of all the network. I mean, the network always wins, somebody told a Flemish guy. And I think it's we're ever more active in a global environment. And as a small team, you really need to reach out for these other continents, and you cannot do it alone. You need partners there. You need boots on the ground. And of course, offices are really expensive to have in all continents. So you need to have strong partnerships, ambassadors that create trust for your brand and for your technology within another ecosystem. So that's one of the main reasons. The other reason is also critical mass to other big companies. If you have already worked with one or two companies like Hitachi or Johnson & Johnson in our case, then it creates trust for others. I mean, it's a non-linear phenomenon. From the moment you have the big guys on board, it's easier to get on more big guys.
Yeah, that's correct. But then I think the biggest problem is here, if I understood it very well, is just the first step. How do you get the first big client? What tips and tricks could you share with our audience? Imagine they are in a startup, a scale-up, or they know somebody with a startup scale-up. So where to begin? What could be your suggestion? Is it networking, which is in these COVID times, of course, a lot more difficult?
Oh, it boils down to having something truly innovative, meaning that if you stand out from the crowd, if you have a blue ocean strategy that's really solid, you will get noticed. I mean, of course, you have to do all the tricks and bells of LinkedIn and social media. You need to have solid marketing and you have to be on the airwaves of some of the big guys. And then it boils down to social engineering as well. If you have to penetrate in a large organization, you need to know who can introduce you there, who can create this first trustful interaction. And that's very important to have when you have the opportunity to not spoil it and to create a lighthouse so you can shine for the even higher management in the short term.
Thank you very much, Tine. Trust, that's also something you mentioned already in the beginning of this panel discussion. So how would you describe it? What's, according to you, the most important step for a scale-up?
Yeah, looking back on many years of working in different ecosystems, investing myself, it is sometimes surprising how somebody you met years ago in a different context all of a sudden comes up and brings you a new opportunity. So investing into networking, of course, these days it's a bit different than it was a year ago. But it's not something on the short term. It's something that is done on the long term, and it's these long-lasting contacts that sometimes open a new door. People move. It's actually a very small world if you look at the IT environment in which we operate. Certainly in Belgium here. So I agree that the network really works, that this ecosystem works also between scale-up companies. Sometimes we find each other and together we have a unique value proposition which we can bring to a larger client or a larger corporation, and it moves. An ecosystem is something that moves, and when all things move, when there is lack of stability, the trust and setting the expectations right is it's what keeps you alive.
And are you looking for big companies with the same mindset, or is that not really necessary? Is that a data-driven or a founder-centric, or how do you feel if not only it's a good company to work with, but only if it's a good match?
Yeah. It's quite often a common purpose or a common theme. Like on Mobile Expense, we stand for employee engagement. We work really hard on increasing employee engagement at the customers we serve. And talking about employee engagement, I'm quite often approached by companies from totally different industries who work on that same employee engagement, and that creates a new opportunity. So having a purpose, being clear on your value proposition, as the gentleman said, is sometimes really a plus for being identified or identifying companies you can engage with.
And communicating the value proposition. Have you actively been communicating on the employee engagement or about it?
Yeah, definitely, definitely. And joining initiatives like Herculean's Employee Engagement Awards, which is taking place for the second time this year. That's the stuff that makes it visible, what you stand for, where you are heading towards with your value proposition. Definitely, communication in these days, different and super important.
Well, okay, thank you. So, dear Mark, the next question could be for you. If we talk about such a co-creation, a collaboration, yeah, how do you see the ownership? Is it the CEO, the CIO? According to you, what is it? Or who should it be?
Okay, when the first thing which is very important when dealing with a large corporation as a startup, of course you enter somewhere, and ideally somewhere where you can start to build trust. But it's important, very important, to build over time a multi-layer type of relationship. And because people in large companies change jobs, and so you don't want to depend from one, but also because you often touch technology, business model, new ways of dealing with customers, and so this is not only one responsibility within a large corporation. So to have sustainable relations, you have over time to build different level of relationships. But by the way, that is not different from the relationship between two large companies.
Duco, what do you think?
Well,
Working, yes?
Yeah, Mark is touching on some very important elements. You know, I would say that the CIO, first if you go back, the CIO is really like the CEO of the company, but then takes into account all the technological implications. CEO oversees the whole strategy, but the CIO should be the mirror to mirror all the company wants to achieve with a sort of a digital plan, a digital roadmap. And so as a CEO, you need to have a good understanding of the company, think like the CEO, and then translate that into some big programs, small programs. And as Mark said, you need to have, and Tina as well, you need to have that trust factor. I would recommend that the founder, for example, and the CEO, CIO really see eye to eye regularly, because the company's strategy may change, therefore the digital footprint has to change, and the work at the startup has to adjust as well. Having said that, the big advantage of many small companies today towards the corporate is that when we come from a period now where we customize software for each big company, the opposite is happening. Big companies adapt their processes to the process of a smaller software company. And the reason is that the smaller software company serves hundreds, at any event tens of larger companies, and therefore has to find the most successful common denominator of a given operational process at a large company. And that proves to be much more beneficial, that therefore the actual operations adjust towards the software, rather than what we did in the past is for every company we make a software that's custom fit and leads to long cycle times, no innovation and high cost. What most people don't believe, I remember a few years ago speaking to a big Belgian bank, and I said, I think your application development cost can probably go down by a factor of 80%. And they looked at me and they said, that's not true. And I said, well, when you move in the future to cloud applications, which are much more readily available, I think that your cost will be decimated. And I think that's what we're seeing actually. Companies who take advantage of all the solutions available in the cloud, be it for HR, accounting, whatever other package available to them, will find themselves spending less than what they did in the past.
And why
Maybe I want to
yes?
add something very important on that. As a startup, do not think only about the team you have. You have also, hopefully, advisors, good advisors. And if your market is really large companies, try to have at least one advisor who knows how to navigate in that and can help you. These can help you to then build the trust, but also open the doors, several doors in the same company.
Yeah, maybe adding on to that, to what was said, let's talk technology, right? In today's technical environment for CIOs, integration is done based on standard APIs, it's quite easy to connect, it's quite easy to have a functionality offered by a scale-up or a startup integrated into your business process. So the flexibility, the agility by the IT environments today also allows for way more scale-ups to be brought in and specific functionality, specific offerings to be added to the technology stack within the bigger organizations.
And Tine, if we look at the ownership from the scale-up or startup point of view, the owner, do you see it as CEO, as the investor, for example, the venture capitalist, another one?
All of the above. Maybe as Mark also mentioned, being at a scale-up company, indeed the people that are my advisors around the company are the ones that help to stay on course, are the ones opening doors I would never ever be able to open up myself. So it is for me the collaboration with all these people that matters. They also come with the ideas on how to sharpen the value proposition, be sharp about what you do, which customer you serve. I think you said it, which market you enter. There's tough choices to be made. The Belgian economy and the Belgian possibilities are limited if we only consider that for a scale-up as myself. It's Germany, the UK, other markets which are way bigger. So these choices need to be made, and you need to be smart about making these bets.
Jonathan, I think that you can be the right person to help us out. Is that the same feeling you have, for example?
Absolutely. But in our case, our technology is fairly new, meaning that if you take advisors from the old school, you need to be careful that they are disruptive enough and open for new ideas, because at some point in the scale-up phase, you have to allow some degree of conservatism, but just not too much. And maybe Duco can later on comment on that. But it's really important that you keep your mission, sharp, also from a technological point of view. So you can really defend that you're really discovering, shaping something new, because this world is really changing. And we all know now with Corona that the Black Swan events of this beautiful book are there, and you need to be strongly adaptable to such events. But it's also the case for your product. You need to have a pivoting power which is very agile and very fast if needed.
But how do you have that? I think we are all eager to hear how you really managed to tackle the problem you just described.
Well, it is, in our case, in the RoboVision case, it's a bit a different case, because we haven't external investors, meaning that these external investments, like Fortino, they all have a protocol of requirements like the advisory boards and all these things, and we're still growing in that. We're at this moment defining our advisory board. So in our case, it is different than the typical externally invested scale-up in Flanders. We have a very lean management, a core team which is calling the shots, and where we can decide really fast to do a deal, yes or no, and how to construct a deal, which technology to put into a relationship, because that's also what you need in this fast-moving world. It's is the speed of action, speed of decision.
And why do you think, Tine and Jonathan, because in the beginning you have been describing the plus, why large companies should work with startups and scale-ups, but why are they not able to do it itself in-house? Where's the difference, you think? Is it in like you mentioned, in the teamwork and the smaller teams in the startups and scale-ups?
Well, it's very much the DNA of a start and scale-up. It attracts a different breed of people. I think somebody that goes for a large corporate has also different expectations from life and from a career. I mean, if you take on the average, of course, you have the whole spectrum in both organizations, actually. But it's important to note that, you need both in your team, the hunters and the farmers. You need the change makers, and you need the one consolidating change to have a successful strategy. Only one breed or one kind of people will almost certainly fail. And that's why big corporates, from DNA perspective, from a psychological perspective, need young companies and vice versa. It's this kitchen of innovation that needs both elements.
Duco, I'm convinced that you totally agree on this.
Yeah, I'd like to add something else that's not unimportant. I think, application software budgets are a huge topic for any CIO. There's always more that needs to get done, and the budgets are probably, always constrained. And the real opportunity is that when, as a CEO, you take the view of some local or European software vendors, I think you'll find that for similar products compared to the giant companies, the feature set is comparable, if not better, because it's close to what you need and you have lower, let's say, customization costs, but your overall license fees are significantly lower. I've seen many times, at our companies, we have a company in Brussels, FSC, they deal in CRM packages, for the European market, and they're substantially cheaper than all the worldwide leaders, because when you buy the worldwide leader, then you pay for the name. And I think more and more CROs become, more conscious of that also economic trade-off. You have companies closer by, they are much close to you as a customer, they see you, they live you can count on them, you have that personal handshake, which I think is a great benefit, because as was pointed out previously, there will be black swans, things will change. And as a CEO, there are so many big projects with big companies that smaller companies are just easier to deal with. It can really make your company go ahead on the innovation track much faster.
Absolutely. I think that Jonathan just described it very well, the difference in culture and what it can bring to largest company. It is very interesting, but do you not think that on the contrary, this could also be the problem, working with a totally different culture, and how do you manage that?
Well, it is a problem. I mean, if you see, for instance, a roadmap to AI in many companies, you have this typical pyramidal structure, and then the biggest issue is never the technology itself. It's never the data. It's always the people from the large corporate being afraid of making changes that are too disruptive, and hence waiting a bit too long in this ever-changing environment. And we at RoboVision, together with other scale-up companies in our ecosystem, are convinced that if you wait too long as a big corporate, you will just lose the game in the end, and you will get eaten by the others that took the decision early on to invest in MVPs, in proof of concepts, and to get this innovation kickstarted. Because if there is one thing which is absolutely important in a big corporate is this risk mitigation. They don't want to take risks, but innovation is risk-taking. And then you always need an ambassador or a C-level very high up that manages this movement, this behavioristic pattern of avoiding risks. But in the end, you need to take the risk. So it is often an oxymoron.
I think this can be very insightful information for our audience today. Mark, from another perspective, is it correct? Do you think that it is difficult sometimes in larger companies to break the tradition and to go for real innovation with a startup and scale-up mentality?
Yeah, indeed, that is correct. And that is simply because in a large corporation, and Tine said it very well, you have to pilot the tanker, and the tanker is the current business. It's usually large and generates the cash. But you want as well to pilot the speedboats. And it's not natural for a leader to be able to be very good at both, although the future is an intelligent combination of both. And we spoke a lot about the advantage of the speedboats and the startups, but I also want to highlight, maybe for the startups, a bit of the advantages of the tanker. The tanker is something that can bring any idea, once they are convinced, up to a scale that otherwise is very difficult to achieve, at the speed as well, because a tanker is used to manage huge projects. An impact at the end of any innovation is if you can have a good innovation and then scale it up really big. That is what makes money. And so there's a good combination to have for both, but it's difficult to find leaders who are comfortable in the both domains.
But Mark, it comes at a package, this concept that you clearly describe. If the big corporate wants to embed this scale-up technology or startup technology within its ranks, very often this comes at the request of an equity stake. And at that moment, you really need to be careful with your mission, because from the moment you have an equity stake of company X, you're no longer interesting for company Y, Z, and so on. Depending on the ecosystem, look in pharma. If a big pharma invests in a scale-up, it is almost like a flag to the competition, like, we won, guys, just back off now.
It is, maybe I have a real life example from not too long ago. We invest in a company called Octon, and Octon is redesigning, let's say, the windows for the manufacturing industry. So it becomes much easier to integrate a whole series of machines working on the production line. And we completed that investment with one, let's say, industrial investor called Sandvik, a big industrial group. And actually, a lot of their competitors like that, because they say, well, you know, it gives some, you know, seal of approval to what you guys are doing. And it's not, they don't own the company, they don't have the access to IPs, much, you know, different than anybody else. So it depends on how it's structured, also depends on the industry. Some industries, people really don't trust each other and they're competing, you know, for everything, and it will be more difficult. But some industries really have a common interest to make innovation happen faster, because as a group they win and will lead to more innovation, more profitability. So I agree with Jonathan, sometimes it's difficult, but we recently had an example where it really works out well.
Duco, that's true, and of course I know Benjamin really well, but it depends on the blue ocean context in that industry. If you still have a lot of opportunities, parties are very open to cooperation. But if it's like more closed and you have an oligopoly of devices, for instance a chip market, then it's sometimes difficult to have this trust between one another. I mean,
Jonathan, I fully subscribe to that. If you have an industrial partner in your equity, you need to have a market with thousands of other, you know, potential customers. If you only are serving a market with 10 or 20 customers, you can't afford to have one of them as an equity investor. Too risky. But if, as you say, there's a huge blue ocean opportunity, which in the case of Octon is really to, you know, make manufacturing for all industries a lot cheaper. That obviously has a global interest to bring, for a lot of industries, production back to Europe.
Yeah, but even there, Duco, I advise you to be careful with, for instance, the robot manufacturers. There, the competition is already much harder. If you sell your soul to one, you will have difficulties. I just see that.
Yeah, how do you... Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, Mark, it's up to you.
Okay, so I just wanted to add, because both are right, of course, in these sort of things. It depends on what the case is. But seen from the perspective of a big company, it's not especially a good idea to take a shareholding in the startup. Just because of one comment that Jonathan made, is that will limit the market, potentially. Although there is nothing wrong, like in real life, to start with flirting, then dating, then getting engaged and marrying at the end. But you do that in steps, when you see how your market evolves and what the opportunities are, and not straight from the beginning. At least that's my view.
And what do you think, Mark, of the fact that they say that sometimes large companies, they create a kind of competition among startups in the same ecosystem just to boost them to go the extra mile? What do you think about that?
Yeah, to be very honest and frank, I don't have experience in that. And I don't think too much positive of it, but that's because of lack of experience probably. Because basically this sort of broad blue sky thinking hackathons where nor the startups nor the large companies know exactly what they want to get out of it. My experience is when I see it, it's the outcome, the likely outcome is, good outcome is very, very low in probability.
I absolutely agree with that.
So if I advise startups, I would say don't go into that.
Absolutely.
It's just a waste of time.
Yes.
That's probably it's very black and white. The other thing is when when the problem environment is described well, and a few startups compete there to try to get the best solution out of, best business solution out of it, then I think it's much more useful for everyone, and there's a higher probability to land somewhere that can then be transformed into a project.
Tine, what do you think about
Well,
this? You've been
come on,
listening.
every CEO of a scale-up or startup is an entrepreneur and has this adrenaline wants to win. We're all on Strava, we're all getting visible on LinkedIn. So as long as it's a healthy competition, and I have a real-life example of a fantastic hackathon a bit ago at the port of Antwerp, whereby we really made changes in the entire ecosystem around the port just by having a hackathon, bringing smart people together and having this healthy competition. As long as you nourish and you feed that healthy competition, I believe in it. But when large corporations, large holdings or groups are playing with the invisible hand and are somehow manipulating the playing field for the scale-ups, then indeed my advice would be turn around, run and get out of the situation as soon as you can, because then you won't win. But a bit of competition always triggers me.
Well, but then as a non-expert in this matter, someone was talking about dating, getting married. Is it like in a marriage that when you as a startup or scale-up, you start working with a large company, that you lose all the opportunities working for all the other large companies in the same sector? That they are like, oh, we are not working with that scale-up or startup. Have you witnessed this already?
It is extremely important, and it's a call for all the scale-up entrepreneurs to have the right legal team on board, the right negotiation team, because that's actually black hole number one, what you just described. It is to be so enthusiastic that you have a new customer, to forget the nitty-gritty legal details. I would really suggest to wait 2 months, even 3 months longer for that fantastic purchase order of 100,000 or even millions of euros. Get your conditions right, really, because otherwise you will spoil the future of your company, and it will be really seen in the due diligence, because then the party that does the due diligence will say, like, why did you exclude this market? And you can simply not answer at that point, well, I needed that PO at that time.
I maybe want to add on that. Let's be realistic. In most of the cases, the relationship between a startup and a large corporation stays at the flirting level. They are supplier and customer, and there's no problem with that. It's once you start a bit further, they then are fully subscribed to what Jonathan says, is really to assess what impact is on future options of opportunities.
Okay.
I think that what may be a nice recommendation is, we're addressing here an audience of chief information officers. I think that they are very welcome to sit on boards or advisory boards of many of these smaller scale software companies. They need your input, they need to understand your way of thinking, they need to understand your dilemmas as CIO in a large company. I think that's often missing for the smaller software companies. What happens at the top of the CIO's agenda? And I think more CEOs getting out there, assuming these roles, will reinforce the industry and create a better understanding on both sides.
Well, that's interesting. Dugo, maybe another question. Talking about the CIOs, how should they, according to you, assess the risk of working with startups and scale-ups if you know that, let's say, 90% of them is disappearing within 10 years? If you want to build on a long-term relationship, I think that from the point of view from CIOs, this can be difficult, no?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. But the news is better. Many disappear because they're being acquired by other companies. The beauty of, this is largely the space of B2B software in the cloud, is that it is developed. It can be easily adopted by a bigger company as an asset and be merged into another product. So, we literally see the demand for our software companies coming from all over the world, which proves that even though software may be developed in Berlin, Paris, or Antwerp, it is a very liquid piece of technology and therefore the risk is quite limited. Yeah, not all companies may make it to become the large company they dreamt of initially, but many of them end up as being part of a bigger solution. And therefore the risk, I think, is much reduced.
Tina, maybe I can switch the question because I think some in the panel already mentioned it, that if we look at CIOs, they also switch every 4.3 years. So how, as a startup and scale-up, is it to work with CIOs if you know that also there it may not be for the long run?
Yeah. I see it as an advantage. By the way, the concept of 10 years in the software industry in which I move is like, it's a non-existing concept to me. But yes, CIOs change jobs, change companies, switch seats, and on my view, on long-term building on the ecosystem, that helps because you meet them back. So that is one thing. Secondly, I think it was said by my colleagues here, do not get hooked up with one person who is your ambassador and your driver of the co-creation or the partnership. You'll have to be linked into the organization. You'll have to have a solid waterproof contract written down, because if you develop IP together, it's better to define who has the ownership and the obligations to maintain it. So the multiple layers we talked about, the different connections between the larger corp goes beyond the CIO.
Okay, well, dear Jonathan, Tina, Mark and Duco, although I still have a lot of questions, unfortunately time's up. So maybe to conclude just in one word, could you give a word, a piece of advice to our audience who's looking at you right now? A useful tip and trick, where should they start? What should they do? What should they keep in mind? What's really important according to you, very briefly, Jonathan?
They should really reach out and really make it clear that they're out looking for solutions in start and scale-up communities. So just go to these social media, advert that you are having a challenge, and get people on board with your challenge and dare to change your own organization.
Okay, do it on social media. Change. What do you say, Tina? Maybe
my mantra remains also in this context. When in doubt, move. It's right to be hesitant. It's okay to think about things, but then you have to move. You have to make a step and go for it.
Mark?
Yeah, I would say dare to get out of your comfort zone. The rewards are huge.
Okay, thank you. And then Duco?
I would say think in short cycles. Think short term, demand short-term solutions, and benefit from the short-term solution.
Hopefully that's not meant for politicians.
Well, thank you very much, dear panelists. I think the message is clear. Start flirting, do it Apple easy and Google fast, co-create or disappear. Thank you very much.